Picture a place where the city never sleeps, a variety of smells overwhelm your nose, and each block is a new experience. This place is constantly crowded. The hustling East Asian grandmas trying to sell their bootleg movies, beggars cruising with their coin-filled plastic cups, as the loud chatter of people fills your ears. This place is Jamaica, Queens, in New York City, not to be confused with the Caribbean country. This is the place where I shared my final bits of pure, unadulterated childhood innocence, and the last place I can remember my dad being all but a pile of ashes stored into a labeled box. A part of me still has a complicated bundle of emotions towards the neighborhood. Jamaica doesn't bring a smile to my face, but rather a reminder of where nightmares and anxieties crossed my 7-year-old mind. Before my dad's diagnosis of stage 4 lupus changed my life, the idea of grief wasn't all that life-changing. It just happened. It was a storyline of a Grey's Anatomy or a private practice episode that my mother watched. I didn't really comprehend grief, and I'd imagined both of my parents being in my life forever. That was until my father's diagnosis. I had no idea that my grief would actually start with finding out that my father had lupus. My childhood ended immediately after his diagnosis because hoping that he would make it one day and then maybe the next plagued my mind. Instead of worrying about what drama I would create with my Barbie dolls, I worried whether or not my father would finally be able to utter some words instead of hearing the deafening beeps of the ventilator breathing life into him. My nose had gotten used to that painfully sterile smell of the hospital because it meant I had someone to visit, someone who was pushing to live and recover. Right before he passed, my father called me on January 1st after the ball dropped. I remember he tried to talk to me from his hospital bed, and a part of me felt so hopeless. I felt like that was it. And 5 days later, on January 6th, 2014, it happened. I lost my dad. We don't really expect the tragedies we read about or see on those hospital dramedies to actually happen to us, but they can and they do. The second week of a death is always the hardest because the first one just consists of complete denial. There is simply no way this is happening to you, but it still did. I had to accept that I wasn't invincible from grief. I never was, and you aren't either. In a study done by Mary Speak and WebMD for the tragic pandemic of COVID-19, it was found that 57% of Americans are grieving the loss of someone in the last 3 years. 57%. That's a little over half of the American population. Are you in that 57%? Is the person next to you in that 57%? How many of us in this room are in that 57%? If a majority of us are grieving, why does the simple sentence of, "My father died," evoke a drop of the mouth from my peers? If a majority of us are grieving, why was I constantly isolated when I was a kid, simply by the fact that others had a father and I didn't? Grief, and specifically intense grief, can come with so many effects. It isn't one-dimensional, nor is it curable. We can experience real physical pain from grief. This ranges from fatigue and a loss in appetite to body aches and heart palpitations, and that's simply just the physical toll. For weeks after my father's passing, a huge part of me felt numb. We can experience anger, anxiety, PTSD, suicidal thoughts, and other mental illnesses. I remember being so angry at the world and at myself because this was my life. This grief had taken a hold of my life and my thoughts at only 7 years old. Many people describe grief to be a deep distress caused by bereavement, but that definition barely describes the amount of devastation it brings. To cope with grief, my mother enrolled my brother and I into various programs to help us understand the tragedy that occurred, group therapies, and unorthodox grief camps. I was never big on talking. I hated the whole idea of being placed in a circle and encouraged to talk about your feelings. It all seemed pretty useless to me, but I now realize that talking has power. If anything, talking has allowed me to not feel so alone, because if there's anything grief is great at, it's making you feel small, like you're the only one dealing with this tragic circumstance. But remember, 57% of us could be struggling at any given time. To get over the denial and anger stages of grief, we have to talk about it. We have to talk about our feelings. And that's very scary, but if we don't, all the pain stays with us forever. Almost a year or so after my father died, my mother introduced my brother and I to an organization called Case Club. This place catered to those dealing with grief, especially kids who couldn't really process it all, for kids who were just like me. Their grief camp over the summer always had a walk at the end. We all had to make a bag with a picture of the person that passed, writing whatever we wanted about them and placing them outside our cabins. We walked by with our cabin supervisors and our peers, passing by every cabin and looking at every bag. It reminds you that after a week full of fun, the grief is still there. You find that grief isn't a death sentence to your happiness. You read the words written for the deceased. You hear the sobs. You comfort your peers who have now become a friend through this pain, and eventually, it's over. We all stop crying, and everyone is closer. It reminds us that this pain will pass. It has to. If anything, programs like this were what taught me to keep pushing. It allowed me to find comfort in my grief instead of letting it destroy me. Grief pushed me to strive for happiness. There was and still is no handbook on how to really deal with grief. Adults and those who have no idea will just tell us to deal with it. But grief doesn't like to be dealt with. I'm not exactly the poster kid for a grieving child, but I know what it feels like. And nearly every other person that we see is most likely dealing with grief in some way. So why should we have to wait until it happens to us to actually care about it? I'm not saying we have to have a negative outlook on the topic, but we can acknowledge that grief evokes an enormous change. It's up to you to decide whether or not you can make that change a good one. After accepting the complex emotions of grief, I became more accepting to my own emotions. At around age 9, my emotional maturity significantly differed than kids my own age. It allowed me to understand the importance of having no regrets. I never wanted to regret not saying something or doing anything. So yes, grief sucks, but it doesn't have to. We only have one life. Why not be the best possible version of ourselves? Almost a decade later, when a friend found out that my father had passed, she stared back at me in confusion, shocked that I've never mentioned this major loss. In her own words, she said to me, "Now, Leigh, that is some trauma." To most people, my dad's death is some trauma, but for me, it has grown and become a part of who I am. Everyone calls me strong for the things I experienced, and for the longest time, I doubted it. But I am strong, you're strong, we're all strong. So why should we act like grief is a topic that can be shushed away? We shouldn't be expected to hold it all in. Besides talking about it, there's the acceptance of reality. To cope with that part of me that refused to deal with this familial loss, I had to accept that my father was not coming back. He will never be able to walk me down the aisle, and he'll never send me off to college, but that's okay. I'm okay. It came with a lot of tears, anger, talking about my feelings, and whatever I needed, but I had to let the pain out. Grief isn't some curse. It isn't bad luck or the universe treating you like dirt. It's life, a part of it anyway. When we accept grief in its entirety, it can be used to push who we are. I couldn't let grief define me forever. My dad's passing pushed me to keep writing, because if there was anything my father would have wanted me to do, it was to pick up that pen and paper and write, to use my voice. I remember a year after his passing, I wrote a fantasy book, shows and movies, and anything else I could conjure up in my brain. I couldn't let my dad's life end there in the hospital. Instead, I started to live life as much as I could. Acknowledging the presence that someone had in your life isn't sad at all. It's actually one of the most beautiful things about life. We don't know how much time we have in this world, so it's best to just live as much as we can. Every time I pick up a new hobby, laugh with my friends, or travel to different places, I feel my dad's presence there. Acknowledging grief is more than shutting down or having an awkward reaction. Grief is here to stay, and we will each experience it one day, whether we like it or not. The name Jamaica Queens is enough to make me recall all the stolen memories associated with the neighborhood. Yet, I seek to focus on not dodging that feeling, because repressing that time in my life is throwing away a part of who I am. I now have a newfound realization towards life. I walk to this neighborhood on the outskirts of New York City and am reminded of all the happiness it brought the younger me. The oatmeal cookies that my dad and I loved, which I would buy at the corner of our street, the laughs we shared in our apartment, seeing his face light up while he watched his favorite show in the living room, and how I favored him doing my hair instead of my mom. Those memories are still a part of me. When a person dies, the memories and connection they shared with you are worth more than one singular lifetime. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm still grieving, but look, here I am, talking to all of you now, using my voice as he would have wanted me to. Before I go, I'm begging you to just grieve. Talk about your feelings. Don't become numb. Feel what you need to feel and rise from the better for you and for them. Thank you.